So in this video, we're going to think about the sizes of cells to try and give you a sense of scale as to how big the cells that we're going to be talking about might be. So before we do that, we need to think about some biological units in terms of scale. Okay. So let's start with 1 millimetre. Okay, so 1 millimetre on your conventional ruler is pretty small, okay, but I've drawn this 1 millimetre much bigger here. So 1 millimetre is obviously 1,000th of a metre. Okay, and that's a unit that we are used to. And some cells are about a millimetre across, but those are quite unusual cells. Most cells are much smaller than that, so we need to think about subdividing that millimetre even more. So the most common unit that we use in biology is the micrometer. So if I just draw that in there. So 1 micrometer, which has this funny U symbol with a little tail on, that's the micro symbol. Okay? So 1 micrometer is 1,000th of a millimetre. So if I take that millimetre and I divide it into 1,000 tiny divisions, then those divisions I call a micrometre. Okay? Sometimes we're thinking even smaller than that. So if I have two lines very close together there, we can think also in terms of nanometers. So 1 nanometre is 1,000th of a micrometre. Therefore, it's a millionth of a millimetre. Okay, so when we're dealing with very small things like viruses, we might be thinking in the nanometre range. But usually in most of the biology that we're looking at, we're thinking in micrometres. Okay, so we might want to first of all think about how we might convert from one of those to the other. And there's a simple way of doing it. So if you think about millimetres, micrometres and nanometres. Okay. The way that we convert between these is simply to either times or divide by 1,000. So if we want to go from millimetres to micrometres, we need to times by 1,000. So if we want to go in the other direction, we need to divide by 1,000. And the same is true when we go from micrometres to nanometres. So times by 1,000 to go in that direction and divide by 1,000 to get in that direction. So let's look at an example. Let's say that we've got something that is 350 micrometres across. Okay. And the question is, well, what is that in millimetres or in nanometres? So if we go for millimetres, to go that way, to get in millimetres, we need to divide by 1,000. So we do 350 divided by 1,000 equals 0.35. So 350 micrometres is 0.35 millimetres. Okay. Or we can go in the other direction, so we can say how much is that in nanometres. So to go to that direction, we would times by 1,000. So we'd say 350 times by 1,000 is 350,000 nanometres. Okay, so if you use that little rule there, then that will allow you to convert between these biological units, and that's one of the sorts of things that we might be asked to do in some of the questions on our module. Okay, so those are the units that we're looking at. So now let's think about some actual biologically interesting things. So let's start off with something that we know how big it is. Let's start off with a needle. Okay, so if I draw a needle like that. Okay, so a needle is roughly 2 millimetres across, and using our little scheme down here to get to micrometres, we times by 1,000, so that's 2,000 micrometres. Okay, so that's a needle. So next to that we might have, let's say we've got some salt grains. So little cubes, individual salt grains. So each of those is about 0.3 millimeters across, which is the same thing as 300 micrometers. Okay, so again, we've just times by 1,000 to convert that. Okay, so now let's think about this. So let's zoom in. Okay, so now that's the edge of one of my salt grains, which, as I say, is about 0.3 millimeters, is 300 micrometers. Okay. Now we might be in a range where we can start to think about some biological cells. So a eukaryotic cell might be about that sort of size. I'll tick cells. So they are about, they can be anything from about 10 to 100 micrometers across. So a typical human cell might be about 20 micrometers across. Okay, we might be able to just see the little nuclei in those. Okay, so yeast cells might be a bit smaller, they might be 5 micrometers. A human cell, we might be thinking about 20 micrometers. Okay, so let's zoom in again. Okay, so now I've got a eukaryotic cell. So we might have its nucleus. Okay, the whole cell, so let's call that 30 micrometers. Okay, so the nucleus would probably be about 10 micrometers or so. Again, it varies on the cell type you're talking about, but if you've got a cell of about 30 micrometers, the nucleus would expect to be about 10 micrometers. So how big would a bacteria be? Well, at this scale, bacterial cells would be something like this. Okay, so our bacterial cells would be probably about 2 microns by 0.5 microns if they're these rod-shaped cells. Okay, so something like E. coli. So that will be 2 micrometers. Okay, and that's quite useful because inside our eukaryotic cell we obviously have mitochondria. Okay, they are also about 2 micrometers across, because we know that bacteria and mitochondria share a common ancestor, and you can see more about that in the cellular evolution video. So they're roughly about the same sort of size, so that could be quite useful in terms of calibrating between the two. So our eukaryotic cell is about 30 micrometers in total, the nucleus is about 10, the mitochondria about 2 micrometers. Our bacteria were about 2 micrometers times 0.5 if they're this sort of rod, so this sort of oval-shaped cell. So that just leaves us to have some viruses, which I'll do in blue. So our viruses are about 0.1 micrometers, which is about 100 nanometers. So we need to get right down to that nanometer scale for the viruses. So on my diagram here, my viruses would be looking around about that sort of size relative to both the eukaryotic and the bacterial cells. Okay, so we've gone from our needle, so something about 2 millimeters, down to our salt grains, down to our eukaryotic cells, to our bacterial cells, and ultimately to our viruses, using those biological units. Okay, so knowing how big cells are is quite useful for understanding how they work, and for that you need to be really confident with these units here. So make sure that you're able to convert between the units, so you're really happy with what scale you're looking at when we're thinking about biological sizes.